Imagine for a moment that you were in the year 371 BC. For more than 200 years, a single Greek city-state ruled the known military world. Its warriors were thought to be unbeatable. Its fighting styles were copied by all other armies, and its name alone was enough to make kings and generals shake with fear. We are talking about Sparta, the most feared war machine of all ancient times. But in a single day on a plain called Leuctra, all that changed forever. A battle lasting just a few hours destroyed 300 years of Spartan military power and changed the course of Greek history. And most amazing of all, it was done through a battle plan so simple, yet so clever, that it changed the way wars would be fought for the next 1,000 years. This is the story of the Battle of Leuctra, where a general named Epaminondas used what we might call the first truly game-changing secret weapon in military history. A new idea that relied not on new technology, new materials, or new weapons, but rather on an idea so brilliant it turned ordinary soldiers into a force that could break the most feared military formation of the ancient world. If you're enjoying, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment with the time you're watching this video. To fully understand how important what happened at Leuctra was, we must first understand what made the Spartans so special. We're not just talking about well-trained soldiers or brave warriors. The Spartans had created something that had never existed before in human history, a society completely focused on war. From the moment they were born, Spartan boys were checked for their strength and military ability. Those thought to be weak or defective were left in the mountains to die. Those who survived this first test were taken from their families at the age of 7 and given to the state to begin the agoge, the most brutal and efficient military training system ever created. For the next 13 years of their lives, these boys would know no comfort, luxury, or even enough to eat. They were kept hungry on purpose so they would learn to steal food without being caught, which helped them develop sneakiness and bravery. They slept outdoors, walked barefoot, and were not allowed to wear warm clothing even in the coldest winter. They were beaten regularly, not as punishment but as training to handle pain. But the most important part of the agoge wasn't physical training, however extreme. It was mental training. These young men learned that they didn't exist as individuals, but only as part of a bigger group. Their identity, their worth, their very existence had meaning only within the Spartan military formation. They didn't fight for personal glory, wealth, or conquest. They fought because fighting was literally their only reason for existing. At 20, if they survived training, they became full soldiers. But even then, their lives remained devoted only to war. They could not have other jobs, could not do business, and could not even live with their wives until they were 30. Their only job in Spartan society was to fight. The result of this system was a type of soldier the world had never seen before. The Spartans were not only better trained, though they were the best masters of the phalanx formation. They had something far more valuable, a discipline and group unity that seemed almost supernatural. In battle, the Spartans moved as one living thing. Their spears swung in perfect rhythm, their shields lined up perfectly, and when they marched, the sound of their feet hitting the ground together was described by witnesses as sounding like an earthquake coming closer. But the Spartans' true secret weapon wasn't their individual skill, technique, or even their discipline. It was something much deeper. They simply didn't run away. While other Greek soldiers might break and run when the battle became too intense, the Spartans stayed in position until death. They had been trained from childhood to believe that death was better than dishonor, and that leaving the formation was the greatest dishonor possible. This way of thinking created an interesting mental effect. The Spartans' enemies began battles already half defeated. They knew they were facing men who would not retreat, would not negotiate, would not surrender. It was like fighting a force of nature. The Spartan Phalanx formation became the foundation upon which Sparta's entire military power was built. The Phalanx was not a Spartan invention. Other Greeks used it too, but the Spartans perfected it until it became the most powerful weapon of the ancient world. Imagine a wall of bronze and iron moving toward you. In the front rows, soldiers with huge shields, each covering half their own body and half the body of the man beside them. Behind them, row after row of long spears sticking forward like the quills of a giant porcupine. As this formation moved forward, the spearheads of the back rows lined up with those of the front, creating an iron wall that reached several meters in front of the shields. The sound was terrifying. The metallic clang of hundreds of shields and spears hitting against each other as the formation moved, combined with the soldiers' war cries and the rhythmic thud of thousands of feet marching in perfect time. Many enemies simply ran before even physical contact. For those brave or foolish enough to face a Spartan phalanx, the reality was even worse than expected. When two phalanxes crashed together, what happened was a form of fighting that is hard for us today to fully understand. It wasn't a battle of individuals fighting against each other. It was literally a group push with hundreds of men on each side, pressing against each other in a tight mass. The soldiers in the front rows couldn't even swing their weapons freely. They were packed so tightly against the enemy that they could barely move their arms. The fighting consisted mainly of pushing, short dagger stabs, and attempts to use the spearhead beneath enemy shields. Meanwhile, the men in the back rows pushed with all their strength, trying to break the enemy formation through pure pressure. This form of fighting completely favored the Spartans. Their better discipline meant they kept their formation even under extreme pressure. Their better physical training meant they could push harder and longer, and their mindset meant they never gave up. Even when the situation seemed hopeless, the outcome was predictable. Battle after battle, decade after decade, century after century, the Spartan phalanxes crushed their opponents. The enemy formation eventually broke, usually starting on the sides where the pressure was less intense. Once a small part of the enemy line began to retreat, the rest quickly followed, and what had begun as an organized battle turned into a one-sided slaughter. For over 300 years, this plan worked perfectly. The Spartans became the final deciders of military power in the Greek world. They stepped into conflicts, decided peace terms, and set up puppet governments and defeated city-states. Their power was so absolute that other Greek cities often gave up without a fight, choosing humiliation over destruction. But there was a basic problem with this system, one the Spartans themselves didn't realize until it was too late. Their success had created an attitude of arrogance that blinded them to the possibility of military innovation. They had perfected the art of phalanx warfare to such a level that they couldn't imagine anyone developing anything better. More importantly, their war-focused society had created an extremely small population of full citizens. Only true Spartans could fight in the main phalanxes, and their numbers had been shrinking for generations. By the early 4th century BC, there were only a few thousand true Spartan soldiers compared to the tens of thousands in earlier centuries. This population decline forced Sparta to increasingly rely on allies and hired soldiers to add to its forces. But these additional soldiers lacked the training, discipline, or mindset of true Spartans. The Spartan war machine was slowly weakening from within, even as it continued to appear unbeatable from the outside. It was in this situation that the city-state of Thebes and its extraordinary military leader Epaminondas emerged. To understand how Epaminondas managed to break Spartan power, we must first understand who he was and how he came to develop his game-changing ideas. Thebes was not a traditional military power. Unlike Sparta, which was organized completely around warfare, Thebes was mainly a trade and farming city. Its citizens were farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, not professional warriors. In the Greek military ranking, Thebes was considered a second-rate power, capable of defending itself but certainly not capable of challenging Sparta on equal terms. Epaminondas was a product of this more balanced society. He had received a wide education that included not only military training, but also philosophy, math, music, and speaking. This diverse education had developed in him something rare among military leaders of his time, the ability to think truly original thoughts about traditional problems. When Epaminondas began studying Spartan military tactics, He didn't do so with the traditional respect other Greek generals showed. Instead, he studied the Spartan Phalanx with the critical eye of a mathematician solving a problem. He identified its strengths, but also its weaknesses. And more importantly, he began to imagine ways to use those weaknesses. Epaminondas's great insight was to recognize that the power of the Spartan phalanx came not from its uniform strength, but from its unity. The formation worked because all the parts worked together as a single living thing. But this also meant that if you could break that unity at a critical point, the entire formation could collapse like a house of cards. The problem was how to do this. The Spartan phalanx had no obvious weaknesses. It was strong in the center, strong on the sides, and the Spartans themselves were evenly spread along the line to make sure there were no particularly weak sections. Epaminondas' solution was brilliant in its simplicity. If the Spartan phalanx was strong everywhere, then he wouldn't attempt to attack every point. Instead, he would gather all his strength on a single point, creating a local advantage so overwhelming that not even Spartan discipline could resist it. This idea led to the development of what military historians call the oblique formation or deep column of attack. Epaminondas' innovation was relatively simple to describe, but revolutionary in what it meant. Traditionally, Greek phalanxes were lined up directly against each other with the same depth along the entire line. If a phalanx was 8 rows deep, that depth was kept from the left end to the right end. The result was that each section of the battle line had about the same strength as the matching enemy section. Epaminondas completely changed this approach. Instead of keeping the same depth, he gathered most of his soldiers in a specific section of his line, creating a column that was not 8 or 10 rows deep, but 50 rows or more. This superstructure of soldiers was positioned on the left wing of his army, directly opposite the position where the best Spartan soldiers traditionally deployed. The rest of their line was deliberately weakened. Their center and right-wing troops were ordered to move forward slowly and avoid direct fighting for as long as possible. The entire strategy depended on the massive left column breaking through the Spartan lines before the rest of the Theban army was defeated. To make this strategy even more effective, Epaminondas developed additional battle innovations. He created an elite unit called the Sacred Band, made up of 300 soldiers specifically chosen for their courage and skill. These men were positioned at the front of the attack column, where they would fight the elite Spartans in direct combat. But Epaminondas' most important innovation wasn't about battle tactics. It was mental. He understood that his soldiers needed to believe they could defeat the Spartans, something that seemed impossible, given the Spartans' reputation for being unbeatable. To do this, he began a months-long campaign of training and mental preparation. Epaminondas explained to his soldiers exactly how the strategy would work. He made them practice the formation over and over until they could do it perfectly, even under pressure. Most importantly, he convinced them that the Spartans were not superhumans, but simply well-trained soldiers who could be defeated if faced correctly. This mental preparation was crucial. The most brilliant tactic in the world wouldn't work if the soldiers didn't have the confidence to do it when they faced the feared Spartan warriors on the battlefield. The chance to test these theories came in the summer of 371 BC. Tensions between Sparta and Thebes had steadily increased, finally reaching the point where war became unavoidable. The Spartan king Cleombrotus marched into Theban territory with an army that included not only Spartan soldiers, but also allies from several other Greek city-states. For the Spartans, this was another routine campaign. They had faced Thebes before and always won easily. There was no reason to expect this time to be any different. The Spartan plan was simple. March into Theban territory, meet the Theban army, and destroy it in a decisive battle, using the traditional tactics that had worked for 300 years. Epaminondas, for his part, knew this was his only chance. If his new strategy failed, Thebes would be destroyed, and he himself would likely be executed. But if it worked, he would have the chance to break Spartan power once and for all. The two armies met on a plain called Leuctra, in the territory of Boeotia. The battle site was perfect for the type of phalanx fighting both sides expected. It was a flat open area with no natural obstacles that could interfere with traditional military formations. When the Spartans saw the Theban army approaching, they formed their traditional formation. The elite Spartan soldiers were placed on the right wing, a position of honor in the Greek military system. The center of the line was filled by allied troops, while other allies were positioned on the left wing. It was a formation they had used hundreds of times before, against dozens of different enemies, and it had always resulted in victory. But when the Thebans lined up for battle, something was clearly wrong. Instead of the same formation the Spartans had expected, the Theban army appeared unbalanced. The left wing was massively reinforced with rows and rows of soldiers packed into a formation that looked like a column rather than a traditional battle line. The Spartan commanders were initially confused. This wasn't a tactic they recognized or knew how to counter. Some suggested the Thebans had simply made a positioning mistake. Others thought it might be an attempt at intimidation. A show of concentrated force meant more for impression than actual effectiveness. What the Spartans didn't realize was that they were about to face something completely new in the history of warfare. Epaminondas had created the first truly systematic use of the principle of concentration of force, the idea that it was better to be very strong in one area and weak in others than to be moderately strong everywhere. When the battle began, things happened exactly as Epaminondas had planned. The center and right wing of his army moved forward slowly, avoiding direct fighting and giving his left supercolumn time to do its work. Meanwhile, the sacred band at the front of the Theban column ran straight into the best Spartan soldiers. For the first time in decades, the Spartans faced enemy soldiers who not only matched their reputation, but fought with a ferocity that matched their own. But the real innovation wasn't in the individual fighting. It was in the pure physics of the situation. While the elite Spartans faced the elite Thebans in roughly equal combat, behind the leading Thebans was row after row of additional soldiers, all pushing in the same direction, all putting pressure on the same specific section of the Spartan line. The Spartans had never faced such concentrated pressure. Their traditional formation had been designed to withstand uniform attacks along the entire line. There was no precedent for dealing with such a massive force applied to a single point. At first, the Spartans held firm. Their legendary discipline kept the formation together even under extreme pressure. But the physics of the situation were relentless. 50 rows of Theban soldiers pushing against 8 or 10 rows of Spartans created a pressure that simply could not be resisted forever. Slowly, meter by meter, the Spartan line began to retreat. This was a crucial mental moment because the Spartans never retreated. Their entire identity was based on the idea that they would stay in their position until death. As they began to be physically pushed back, something fundamental broke in their group confidence. The decisive moment came when the Spartan king himself, Cleombrotus, was killed in the battle. Spartan kings traditionally fought in the front rows, leading by example, and Cleombrotus had positioned himself exactly where the Theban pressure was most intense. His death not only removed the leader of the Spartan army, but also created a literal hole in the Spartan formation. With the king dead and the pressure continuing without stopping, the section of the Spartan line under direct attack finally broke. Once a small part of the formation began to collapse, the effect spread quickly. The Spartan soldiers, trained their entire lives to maintain their formation, suddenly found themselves with no formation to maintain. What followed was something no Greek had seen in generations. Spartan soldiers running from the battlefield. The retreat quickly turned into a rout, and the rout turned into panic. Within minutes, the army that had dominated the Greek world for 3 centuries was completely falling apart. The final numbers of the battle tell the story themselves. On the Spartan side, over 1,000 soldiers were killed, including not only King Cleombrotus, but also 400 full Spartan citizens. For a society that had only a few thousand such citizens in total, these losses were devastating. But the real impact of the Battle of Leuctra went far beyond number losses. In a single day, Epaminondas had shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. He had proven that the Spartans could be defeated, and he had shown exactly how. News of the Theban victory spread across the Greek world like wildfire. City-states that had been obedient to Sparta for decades suddenly began to question their loyalty. Spartan allies began to switch sides. Enemies who had been too scared to openly challenge Sparta suddenly found the courage to rebel. Most importantly, from a military point of view, Epaminondas's tactics were quickly copied and adapted by other generals. The idea of concentration of force, of being very strong at one point rather than moderately strong everywhere, became a fundamental principle of military strategy. This tactical innovation had consequences that reached far beyond the ancient world. Epaminondas's oblique formation directly influenced the development of the tactics that Alexander the Great would use to conquer the Persian Empire just a few decades later. Alexander's innovations in turn influenced Roman military strategists who passed these lessons on to medieval commanders. The principle of concentration of force remains one of the most important concepts in modern military strategy. From Napoleon to the commanders of World War II, military leaders have used variations of the same basic idea pioneered by Epaminondas at Leuctra, concentrating superior force at the decisive point to break enemy defenses. But to fully understand the significance of the Battle of Leuctra, we need to examine not only what happened during the battle, but also its long-term consequences for the Greek world. Immediately after Leuctra, Epaminondas pressed his advantage. Rather than simply accept victory and negotiate a favorable treaty, he decided to completely break Spartan power. Over the next few years, he launched a series of military campaigns that went deep into Spartan territory. The most devastating of these attacks was the liberation of Messenia. For over 300 years, the Spartans had kept the Messenians as serfs, an enslaved population that provided the farming labor necessary to sustain Spartan military society. The entire Spartan economy depended on this forced labor force. When Epaminondas freed Messenia and helped establish an independent city-state there, he effectively cut off the economic basis of Spartan power. Without Messenian labor, Spartan citizens were forced to start working to support their families, which meant less time available for military training. This change created a vicious cycle for the Spartans. With less time for military training, they became less effective soldiers. With less effective soldiers, they lost more battles, which further reduced their territory and resources. With fewer resources, they could support even fewer professional soldiers, which further weakened them. Within a generation of Leuctra, Sparta had become a third-tier military power. The city-state that had dominated Greece for 3 centuries could no longer even effectively defend its own territory. The collapse of Spartan power created a power vacuum in the Greek world that would eventually be filled by Macedonia under Philip II and then Alexander the Great. But in the years immediately following Leuctra, it was Thebes that became the dominant power in central Greece. Epaminondas used this period of Theban supremacy to continue innovating tactically. He developed new formations, experimented with different combinations of heavy and light infantry, and began integrating cavalry more effectively with his infantry forces. These continued innovations kept Thebes at the forefront of Greek military development for nearly a decade. Other city-states sent observers to study Theban techniques, and generals throughout the Mediterranean world began incorporating elements of Epaminondas's strategy into their own tactics. But perhaps Epaminondas's most important contribution to military history was not any specific tactic, but rather his approach to the problem of military innovation. He showed that even the most established military traditions could be overcome through original thinking and careful preparation. This lesson echoed far beyond the battlefields of ancient Greece. The idea that military superiority was not permanent, that new tactics could overcome ancient traditions, became a fundamental principle of strategic thought. Later, military history is full of examples of innovators who followed Epaminondas's example. Alexander the Great used innovative tactics to defeat much larger Persian armies. The Romans developed new formations that outperformed Greek phalanxes. Medieval commanders found ways to use longbows to defeat heavy cavalry. Each of these innovations followed the same basic pattern established at Leuctra, identifying the weaknesses of a seemingly perfect system and developing new tactics to exploit them. But the Battle of Leuctra also teaches us important lessons about the limitations of military innovation. While Epaminondas' tactics were revolutionary, their success depended as much on the specific circumstances as on his own genius. The oblique formation worked against the Spartans, in part because they were mentally unprepared to face something completely new. Generations of victories had created a mental rigidity that prevented them from adapting their tactics quickly enough to face the Theban innovation. Furthermore, the Spartan population decline meant they lacked enough reserves to absorb the heavy losses resulting from the new Theban tactics. A larger, more flexible army might have been able to adapt to the oblique formation by developing countermeasures. These limitations became clear in the following decades as other generals began developing tactics specifically designed to counter the oblique formation. As Epaminondas' innovation became better known and understood, it gradually lost its effectiveness. This pattern of revolutionary innovation, followed by gradual adaptation and eventual obsolescence, would become a constant theme in military history. Every new secret weapon or revolutionary tactic eventually faces countermeasures, forcing a continuous arms race between innovation and adaptation. Thebes itself eventually learned this truth the hard way. After Epaminondas' death in battle in 362 BC, the city-state lost its innovative edge. Without his military genius, the Thebans were unable to develop new tactics to meet the emerging challenges of the changing Greek world. When Philip II of Macedon began his southward expansion, he brought with him military innovations, learned in part by studying Epaminondas' techniques, but which went far beyond them. Philip's Macedonian phalanx was more flexible, better integrated with cavalry, and supported by more advanced siege engines. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, the Thebans found themselves in the same position the Spartans had been in at Leuctra, facing innovative tactics for which they were unprepared. The historical irony was complete when the army that had defeated the Spartans through innovation was itself defeated by even more advanced innovations. But even with the decline of Thebes, the legacy of Epaminondas and the Battle of Leuctra continued to influence military development. Alexander the Great, who fought at Chaeronea as a young prince, had carefully studied Epaminondas' tactics and incorporated many of his principles into his own strategies. The famous cavalry wedge formation Alexander used to break the Persian lines at battles like Gaugamela was a direct application of the principle of concentration of force, pioneered by Epaminondas. Rather than distributing his cavalry evenly along the line, Alexander concentrated it at a specific point to create an overwhelming local superiority. This continuity of tactical innovation shows how military ideas evolve over time. Each generation of commanders builds on the discoveries of the previous one, refining and adapting established concepts to meet new challenges. The Romans, who would eventually conquer the entire Mediterranean world, also learned valuable lessons from the Leuctra experience. Although they developed a very different military system based on the legion rather than the phalanx, they incorporated the principle of concentrated force into their own tactics. The Roman formation known as the cuneus was essentially a version of Epaminondas' attack column, adapted to the Roman style of combat. When facing particularly stubborn enemies, Roman commanders would often concentrate several cohorts at a single point to break through enemy defenses, just as Epaminondas had done centuries earlier. Most importantly, the Romans understood the broader lesson of Leuctra about the importance of tactical flexibility. Unlike the Spartans, who had become rigid in their approach to warfare, the Romans constantly adapted their tactics to face new enemies and new situations. This flexibility allowed the Romans to successfully confront an impressive array of opponents, from Greek phalanxes to Gauls' tribal warriors, from Hannibal's war elephants to Parthian heavy cavalry units. Each new challenge was met with tactics tailored specifically to the situation. Leuctra's lesson in military innovation has continued to echo through the centuries. During the Middle Ages, commanders like Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours and William the Conqueror at Hastings applied variations of the same basic principle, concentrating superior force at the decisive point to break enemy defenses. The post-medieval era saw even more sophisticated applications of these concepts. Napoleon Bonaparte, perhaps the most famous practitioner of the art of force concentration, developed his entire strategy around the idea of arriving on the battlefield with more soldiers than the enemy at the decisive moment and place. Napoleon's famous interior line maneuvers were essentially large-scale versions of Epaminondas' tactics. Instead of concentrating soldiers on a specific section of a battle line, Napoleon concentrated entire armies against specific portions of the enemy forces, defeating larger coalitions by applying superior force at critical points. This evolution of tactical concepts shows how a single innovation can have consequences that span thousands of years. The basic idea Epaminondas developed that it is better to be very strong in one place than moderately strong everywhere became one of the fundamental principles of military strategy. But the Battle of Leuctra also teaches us important lessons about the nature of military leadership. Epaminondas was not only a tactical innovator, he was also a charismatic leader capable of inspiring his soldiers to believe they could achieve the impossible. The mental preparation he conducted before the battle was as important as his tactical innovations. His soldiers entered the battlefield knowing exactly what was expected of them, and confident that their plan would work. This confidence was crucial to the success of the operation. This lesson about the importance of morale and mental preparation also became a standard element of military doctrine. Later commanders understood that even the most brilliant tactic would fail if soldiers lacked the confidence to execute it under pressure. The integration of tactical innovation with inspirational leadership has become the hallmark of great military commanders throughout history. Alexander combined brilliant tactics with personal charisma. Julius Caesar was both a military innovator and a troop motivator. Napoleon understood both the science and the art of war. In all these cases, we can trace a direct line back to Epaminondas and the Battle of Leuctra. The pattern established there of combining tactical innovation with careful preparation and inspiring leadership became the model for military excellence. But perhaps Leuctra's most important lesson is the temporary nature of military superiority. The Spartans had dominated for 3 centuries, but their dominance ended in a single day when they faced something they were unprepared for. This lesson has echoed throughout history. Empires that seemed unbeatable discovered that their military superiority was temporary when new enemies developed tactics or technologies for which they were unprepared. Thebes itself experienced this reality just a few decades after its victory at Leuctra. The empire that had seemed unbeatable under Alexander crumbled after his death. Rome, which had dominated the world for centuries, eventually fell to enemies who had learned to exploit its weaknesses. This cycle of military superiority has become one of the most reliable constants in history. Every dominant military system eventually faces a challenger that has developed ways to neutralize its advantages. The modern era dramatically accelerated this cycle. World War I saw the traditional dominance of infantry challenged by new technologies such as machine guns, heavy artillery, and tanks. World War II introduced aerial warfare, radar, and finally nuclear weapons. Each innovation made previous tactics obsolete, almost overnight. In the contemporary world, this process of innovation and counter-innovation is happening even more rapidly. New technologies such as drones, cyber warfare, and satellite guidance systems are constantly changing the nature of military conflict. But even in this environment of rapid technological change, the basic principles Epaminondas established at Leuctra remain relevant. The importance of force concentration, tactical flexibility, and mental preparation remains fundamental to military success. Modern commanders still study the Battle of Leuctra not only as an interesting historical event, but as a timeless example of how innovation can overcome established traditions. The specific tactics used may be outdated, but the underlying principles remain valid. Modern warfare may be fought with guided missiles and stealth planes instead of spears and shields, but the need to concentrate superior force at the decisive point remains as important today as it was in 371 BC. Equally important is the lesson about the need for mental flexibility. The Spartans lost at Leuctra not because they were inferior soldiers, but because they became too rigid in their thinking. They failed to adapt quickly to a new and unexpected situation. This same mental rigidity has been the downfall of many military commanders throughout history. Generals who became too attached to tactics that had worked in the past often found those same tactics ineffective against new types of enemies or in new circumstances. The ability to think originally about military problems, the quality that made Epaminondas so effective, remains one of the most valuable traits a commander can possess. This is also a lesson that extends far beyond the military in business, technology, and many other areas of human activity. Success often goes to those who can think innovatively about traditional problems. The same mindset that allowed Epaminondas to see weaknesses in the seemingly perfect Spartan formation is the mindset that allows modern entrepreneurs to spot opportunities others fail to see, or scientists to make discoveries that revolutionize our understanding of the world. Ultimately, the Battle of Leuctra is important not just as a military event, but as an example of the power of innovative thinking to transform seemingly impossible situations. When Epaminondas began planning his strategy, facing the Spartans on equal terms seemed completely impossible. They had dominated Greek warfare for 3 centuries, had the finest soldiers in the world, and used tactics that had proven their effectiveness in hundreds of battles. But Epaminondas didn't accept that this situation was permanent. Instead, he carefully analyzed the problem, identified opportunities that others had missed, and developed a completely new solution. The outcome changed the course of world history. Had Epaminondas not defeated the Spartans at Leuctra, Sparta might have continued to dominate Greece for centuries. This could have prevented the rise of Macedonia as a power, which in turn could have prevented Alexander's conquests. Without Alexander's conquests, Greek culture might not have spread throughout the Mediterranean world and the Middle East. Without this cultural influence, the later development of Roman civilization, and through it, Western civilization might have been completely different. This chain of consequences shows how a single tactical innovation developed by one man in a small Greek city-state can have effects that extend across thousands of years and affect the development of entire civilizations. The broader lesson is that no situation, no matter how settled or permanent it seems, is beyond the possibility of change through innovative thinking and determined action. The Spartans seemed unbeatable until someone figured out how to defeat them. Many other seemingly permanent institutions, empires, political systems, dominant technologies also discovered their permanence was an illusion when faced with determined innovators. This is perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the Battle of Leuctra, that the status quo, no matter how powerful, can always be challenged by those with enough vision, preparation, and courage to try something new. Epaminondas and his Theban soldiers proved that even the most established systems have weaknesses, and that these weaknesses can be exploited by those smart and brave enough to think differently. This is a lesson that remains relevant today, whether on the battlefield, in the boardroom, or in any other arena where people compete to achieve goals. Innovation remains the most powerful weapon against established orthodoxy. The Battle of Leuctra reminds us that no advantage is permanent, no domination is eternal, and that there is always room for those willing to challenge conventional thinking with new and better ideas. Ultimately, this battle, fought over 2,000 years ago, on a forgotten plain of ancient Greece, continues to teach us valuable lessons about innovation, leadership, and the transformative power of original thinking. That's why the story of Epaminondas and his secret weapon that destroyed the Spartan Phalanx continues to fascinate students of military history, business strategy, and anyone interested in how determined individuals can change the world through revolutionary ideas. The next time you face a problem that seems impossible to solve, or a situation that seems impossible to change, remember Epaminondas at Leuctra. Remember that even the most powerful systems have weaknesses, and that these weaknesses can be discovered and exploited by those willing to think truly original thoughts. The secret weapon that destroyed the Spartan Phalanx wasn't made of bronze or iron. It was made of ideas, preparation, and the courage to try something never before attempted. And it's a weapon that's still available to anyone willing to use it. As we think about this extraordinary story of transformation and innovation, we cannot help but recognize that there is something greater that governs the course of human events: the wisdom to see what others cannot, the courage to challenge the impossible, and the determination to keep going against all odds. These are qualities that ultimately reflect gifts that go beyond our merely human understanding. As the Lord God has said throughout the ages, man's thoughts are not my thoughts, neither are his ways my ways. Perhaps the true miracle of Leuctra was not just Epaminondas' tactical genius, but the fact that at the right moment in history, he was given the wisdom necessary to see beyond appearances and find a solution where others saw only impossibility. This is, after all, one of the great lessons we can draw not only from this battle, but from all of human history, that in the most decisive moments when the future hangs in the balance, there is always the possibility that divine wisdom will show itself through human action, transforming the impossible into reality and forever changing the course of events.